Today at the National Press Club, Ukraine's ambassador to Australia, Vasyl Myroshnychenko. Nearly 4 years on from Russia's invasion of Ukraine, the ambassador will argue his country now stands on the front line of a broader confrontation with authoritarian revisionism. Here's Vasyl Myroshnychenko with today's National Press Club address.
Welcome to the National Press Club here in Canberra for today's Westpac address with the Ukrainian ambassador, Vasyl Myroshnychenko. Welcome, Vasyl. I'm Greg Jennett, a director at the club and an ABC reporter when I'm not doing this. As we just heard, within a fortnight, the Russia-Ukraine war will have lasted 4 years, and as it enters its 5th year of fighting, it's fair to say it continues to defy all hopes and expectations that an end might have been reached by now, either through victory, defeat, retreat, or negotiation. The cost, of course, in human lives has been diabolical, and that's before we get to considerations about the lifelong scarring effect that it will have on a generation of warfighters who survive it, and then the reconstruction costs that lie beyond for Ukraine. Now, having arrived here in Canberra within 2 months of the war starting with Russia's invasion, Vasyl has been Ukraine's champion and advocate in Australia, whether that's on visa rights for Ukrainians who sought refuge here, whether it's on military aid, energy aid, and significantly the raising of much-needed cash from corporate, philanthropic and general community donors. So fair to say he's had his work cut out for him during the 4 years of this posting. Now, this isn't Vasyl's first appearance here at the club. In fact, I understand he told me earlier that it is his third. Today, I should note, before handing over to the ambassador, is a rather eventful one here in the nation's capital with the visit by the Israeli president. Parliament is sitting and Senate estimates hearings are underway. So we'll have the address. There will be questions afterwards, and we do hope that, notwithstanding those other commitments, more reporters will join us throughout this session. But as I say, the ambassador is back to give an important address at this milestone for his country, titled Russia's War on Ukraine, an Alternative Narrative. Let's welcome now Vasyl Myroshnychenko with his Westpac National Press Club address.
Thank you, Greg. Thank you. Members of the National Press Club, members of Press Gallery, members of the Australian Parliament, fellow members of the Diplomatic Corps, distinguished guests, supporters of Ukraine watching here in Australia and around the world, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for the honor of making a nationally and internationally broadcast address today. As we approach the 4th anniversary of the illegal and unprovoked full-scale Russian invasion of Ukraine, an invasion marked by the deliberate and cruel targeting of civilian homes, of energy networks, intended to weaponize winter as a means to kill innocent civilians. Before I begin, I wish to acknowledge the murders of our respective citizens during the Bondi anti-Semitic terrorist attack of the 14th of December 2025. All those murdered deserve a place in our hearts, and I especially recognize those with a Ukrainian connection. Boris and Sofia Gurman, who paid with their lives as they wrestled with the terrorists at the very outset of the attack. Little Matilda, a 10-year-old who was named for a miracle of her birth with the most Australian name her parents could imagine. Alex Clayton, Reuben Morrison, Tibor Witzen. Both Australia and Ukraine have a shared destiny in defending ourselves against the international forces of ideology, violence which seek to destroy our ways of life and our values. It is very tragically not the first time that our two countries share a bond of trauma, and it will not be the first time that our two countries stand side by side for recovery, healing, and triumph of good over evil. MH17 was an outrage for which Russia must be held accountable. Today, I will focus on an alternative narrative about Russia. I will challenge some of the notions that surround Russia's disgraceful invasion of Ukraine, a war of illegal territorial annexation, and I will advocate for an alternative approach. First, I will start with an exchange that is 1,000 years old. Adam and Eve asked God, "Why did you make Ukraine so perfect?" God replies, "Wait until you meet the neighbors." When I first proposed to mark the 4th anniversary of Russia's outrage, I met some strong resistance. Let it go, give it a rest, time to move on. There are other priorities for public debate. This is Europe's problem, and the Australian audience is not interested. Really? Could the proposition be true that people think this way? No, it is not. Not according to the professional research of Australian attitudes. Australians are far more attached to the ideal of a resolution to this invasion on Ukraine's terms. And they want to hear more, not less. I have no doubt that some institutions want to wish away the war, and there is analytical and strategic wariness about how and when the war will end. But that is precisely the fertile ground for the Russian false narratives about the war. We must collectively resist the temptation to reduce our efforts against predatory major powers. There is no easy life in this world. If we do not resist brutalist predatory major powers, then we volunteer ourselves to be bullied. Australia, as a significant middle power, has a global role to play. Before I discuss the Russian false narratives, I want to spend a minute discussing the term narrative and its power. A narrative, a clear narrative, tells a simple story form, the justification or a strategy being undertaken, and then a series of policies of actions are taken which seem to support the story. In a post-truth world, where simply asserting something makes it true, the contest is not in the boardroom, not on the stock exchange, or the ballot box, or the battlefield. The contest is in the public perception of the reality of the narrative. If you can make the narrative stick, the facts don't matter. And that is why propaganda, disinformation, misinformation, foreign influence, and the aggressive placement of alternative facts are so powerful today. If you listen to President Putin's narrative, Russia is a benevolent superpower engaged in the liberation of Ukraine and defending itself against NATO aggression. And NATO is on the verge of Russia is on the verge of complete victory. Russia's story is that any peace settlement with Ukraine must reflect that version of reality, including the surrendering of Ukrainian territory, because Russia is going to win anyway. You can hear that narrative reflected in phrases like, NATO must recognize reality, and Ukraine must make concessions. But let us test that Russian narrative with a simple comparison. On the 22nd of June 1941, Germany invaded the Soviet Union, pushing Soviet forces back to Moscow and to two major cities then called Leningrad and Stalingrad. On July 12, 1943, the Soviet counteroffensive began. It covered around 2,000 kilometers and took about 660 days, ending with the Soviet capture of Berlin and the surrounding area in May of 1945. 4 years ago, with the 21st century weapon systems, with surprise on his side, President Putin announced a 10-day special military operation intent on capturing Kyiv. 1,448 days later, and after occupying only 12% more of Ukraine's territory than it held before the invasion, and not a single provincial capital, Putin's 10-day special military operation is looking more like a strategic failure it is. More than a strategic failure it actually is. And the near total victory his current narrative claims. During 2025, Russia succeeded in occupying an additional area of Ukraine that is equivalent to twice the size of ACT, at the cost of hundreds of thousands of its own casualties. At the same time, constantly evolving Ukrainian drone warfare capability has seen some 35% of Russia's domestic oil processing decimated. In truth, Putin is not really winning, and the EU, other middle powers like Australia, and other security partners need to make that clear diplomatically and in public. They need to look at the historical context too. Russia has won no wars in the 20th and 21st centuries, other than the Second World War, bankrolled by the West. While we are examining the Soviet legacy, it is worth noting that the experience of former member states of the USSR is recalled with horror. Neither Ukraine, nor Lithuania, Latvia, Estonia, Poland, or others have any wish to be ruled by Moscow again. We have really suffered under Moscow, never again. We have our independence, our sovereignty, our territorial borders, and there is no legitimate reason why we should surrender any of them to Moscow or to Putin. Another of Russia's narratives is that President Putin is a man of peace, of reason, and has legitimate humanitarian grievances against Ukraine. The narrative goes on to say he now seeks a peace outcome and that somehow Ukraine and NATO are provocateurs who brought this invasion on themselves. Again, the contest is in the narrative, and some involved in diplomacy and diplomatic outcomes incline towards the Russian narrative, casting Ukraine's resistance to a complete capitulation as a sign that Ukraine acts in bad faith. But the narrative that Putin is a man of peace is easily countered. There is an old saying, "Show me the youth and I will show you the old politician." Putin is a product of his formative years. He was a thug from the slums of Leningrad, easily recruited into the KGB, rose to the head of the successor agency, and was deeply traumatized by the collapse of the Soviet Union. He wants that power back. His worldview is based on a state power, control over the media and any who oppose him, and an aggressive and violent foreign policy based on regime change and territorial acquisition. There should be no sense that he enters into peace negotiations in good faith. Know that his undertakings can be relied upon. During the course of the war, Putin has rejected more than 20 unilateral offers of immediate ceasefire by Ukraine, many of which had the backing of the United States and other players. It is all part of the old KGB playbook being enacted. Opposition figures die while on walks in the snow or from drinking radioactive tea. Journalists are murdered. Planes mysteriously explode. Lethal Novichok nerve agent is found on door handles. Those who fall out of favor also fall from balconies. Gray zone warfare is clearly underway, and international disinformation and foreign interference operations are conducted on industrial scales. Is there any wonder that Ukraine does not want this to be its future? So the natural question follows. Why would middle powers enable or tolerate such an outcome? If only because they allow Russian narrative to go unchallenged in public? Remember, narratives are a contest of storytelling. Facts are drowned out by stories, and stories become the new facts. False narratives need to be countered, loudly and in public. There is no joy to be found in being on the wrong side of history. Much has been said about Russian invasion of Ukraine being a test or a crisis of the international rules-based order. Perhaps that phrasing needs to be set aside, at least for the time being. It is certain that the international rules-based order needs wholesale repair and reconstitution, but it seems not to be fit for purpose any longer, at least in our current times. The foundation of the international rules-based order was always taken to be the UN. But the UN seems to be powerless when Russia, a permanent member of the Security Council and a nuclear weapons state, embarks on a war of territorial annexation, directly contrary to the UN Charter, and threatens Ukraine, a non-nuclear weapons state, with atomic attack if it continues resistance, or if it retaliates in kind along the same lines of the outrages committed by Russia. If this, the broadest planks of the UN platform, go consequence-free or are enforced by the UN, if not outright rewarded with a forced Ukrainian capitulation to Russia, then lesser elements of the international rules-based order are also fatally corrupted. Perhaps the golden rivet of international security is found in nuclear weapons and arms control treaties. These are the agreements which gave middle powers confidence that whatever else may happen, nuclear war will not be our destiny. With the imminent expiry of the last of the nuclear arms control treaties and no sense of an extension or replacement agreement, the rational rules-based world order we have known since the 1950s and the 1970s is fast fading. Russia will be free to threaten nuclear war to get what it wants. I note here that Ukraine gave up its post-Soviet nuclear weapons in exchange for territorial and security guarantees, which Russia signed, but that seems an idealistic move in retrospect. It poses the question, should small or middle powers now embark on their own nuclear weapons programs in the face of predatory major powers? Keen to be seen as a superpower and enjoy the geostrategic benefits of such, Russia also has an economic and energy narrative that needs to be challenged. Even with the total transformation into a military footing, Russia's GDP growth is approaching zero, and inflation is around 6%. Its budget revenues have been halved with the collapse of its gas station economy. Interest rates stand at 16%, making investment outside the mafia system near impossible. At the same time, 2026 has seen Russia suffer significant setbacks. The disruption of its client regime in Venezuela and the unrest that it sees as its allies in Iran, the main supply of drones that fall on Ukrainian cities on the brink. As I near the end of my speech, I reflect on the observation that was recently shared with me. The topic was the Titanic disaster, where the tragedy lay. The observation was that the tragedy lay not in too few lifeboats, but that not one of the lifeboats that pulled away from the sinking ship was actually full. In other words, not everyone who could have been saved was saved. It strikes me that there is a parallel with the Ukraine situation. No one expects the Middle Powers, including Australia, to defeat Russia alone, or to restore the competence of the international rules-based order alone. But is everything that could be done being done? Is there an active and determined contest of narratives underway in public by diplomats, by media, by governments, inside parliaments and outside them? Are Middle Powers doing everything within their grasp or influence to ensure that not one drop of tainted petrochemicals sourced from Russian oil and gas, laundered through third country refineries or storage, enters the supply chain? Is every sanction, every single sanction that could be conceivably applied, being applied? Are security and other arrangements, such as Quad and the firepower defense arrangements, being leveraged in a new and novel ways to exert the influence and determination of Middle Powers? Australia is not without global influence and impact. Australia invented Wi-Fi and gave it to the world as a free good. Imagine the world without Wi-Fi. And more recently, the plain packaging of tobacco products, and now the ban on underage access to social media make global headlines, and they serve as a model for other nations. Ukraine remains deeply grateful for the military, humanitarian, and energy assistance so far contributed to Ukraine by Australia and by many other countries, including sitting here in the room. These contributions have allowed Ukraine to hold our ground. Now we need global powers, including and even led by Australia, to exert their combined influence and impact to generate the diplomatic and reconstruction momentum to ensure a just, sovereign outcome on Ukraine's terms to the illegal and unprovoked Russian invasion by a durable, resilient, and irreversible peace. For those who ask, why doesn't Ukraine just surrender land to Russia? I say this. In 2014, Russia illegally seized Crimea, and that wasn't enough for them. Russia used fake separatists to seize eastern Donbass, and that wasn't enough for them. What makes you think that western Donbass will be enough, when we know he wants Kyiv as well, along with the entire Black Sea coastline? But there is more to this than clinical squares on a chessboard. It's not just sovereign territory that can be traded away like a real estate deal. When Russia occupies Ukrainian territory, Russian troops and secret police torture and murder Ukrainian civilians for resisting Russian occupation. Russian soldiers use rape as a weapon of war. Children are abducted and taken to Russia for assimilation and re-education, Soviet style. Ukrainians are forced to renounce their Ukrainian religious traditions and to adopt Russian Orthodox practices. Many Protestant pastors got kidnapped and killed. Ukrainian culture and language are extinguished and replaced with Russian, including through the Russian school curriculum. Russian passports and citizenship changes are forced on our citizens. And an influx of Russian transmigration drowns out Ukrainian sovereignty. What rational, just, and liberal democracy would ever willingly subject its citizens to such brutality and so many gross human rights violations? What right-thinking nation would consign new urban areas and new rural communities to such appalling and sickening abuses? When people say Ukraine should swap land for peace, they have no compassion or empathy for the Ukrainian people. They are consigning to a horrible fate and a future of anguish and despair. The other day, my 9-year-old son asked me a question that no child should have to ask. Why did Russia invade Ukraine? I told him this. Sometimes a bigger neighbor decides that rules don't matter, that borders don't matter, and that another country does not have the right to choose its own future. Ukraine is fighting because it believes that right does matter, not just for Ukrainians, but for everyone. I explained that we fight for fairness. It is about whether might makes right or whether laws and values protect smaller nations. And I told him that Ukraine is standing up so that children in Ukraine, in Australia, and elsewhere don't grow up in a world where force replaces rules. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is why Ukraine fights so hard. Yes, we fight for our sovereign territory, but we really fight for the Ukrainians who live on that territory. Wouldn't you? And if you agree with that motivation, how can middle powers allow the Russian narrative of justification and entitlement go unanswered, unchallenged, and uncontested? Ukraine needs middle powers to diplomatically and politically band together, to stand up, to speak up. Russia has done enough damage already. Enough is enough. Ladies and gentlemen, narratives matter. And countering false narratives matters even more. Australia has a diplomatic and clear public advocacy role in the name of a just peace. Now is the hour for Australia to join other middle powers to speak up and loudly challenge Russia's false narrative. Thank you.
Ambassador Myroshnychenko, thank you so much for your address. It gives rise to plenty of questions, which I might pursue, and I know colleagues will. But perhaps to start, I won't go to a question drawing from the speech. I'll ask one about the current state of negotiations or planned negotiations. So your president last weekend indicated that there could be another round of three-way talks with the United States in Miami this week, and indicated that that would be Washington trying to pursue resolution by June. Do you see that as, or does Kyiv, your government, see that as a deadline as far as the Trump administration is concerned?
Ukraine government is committed to negotiating and getting a positive outcome for Ukraine, that's for sure. And certainly we have been committed to negotiating from the very beginning of President Trump's presidency, and we rely on his leadership to deliver it together in our negotiations, but certainly involving our European partners, making sure that we can create a system to create security guarantees, to create the system that will be durable and will last. So far, what we have seen from Russia, we have seen that they are not negotiating in good faith. They're interested in having peace talks, but they don't seem to be interested in peace.
So you are not confident about any resolution on that timeline?
We can't be confident, we can be hopeful, because I think, you know, when war broke out 4 years ago and somebody asked me, how long do you think you're going to last? And I was convinced back in 22 it would be over in 2023. And look where we are. I think nobody can be confident. I think when you discuss war, you don't really have, you don't have a magic ball to predict. And certainly, we have seen that Russia is not interested in peace, they're interested in peace of Ukraine. And that's what been kind of a pattern, because as all these negotiations have been going on for the past year, and there have been many different rounds, Russians just intensified their attacks, not only the front lines, but they have intensified their attacks of our civilians, of our critical infrastructure. Kyiv, which is currently freezing, and the temperatures are -20 at night, no water, no heating, no electricity. 2 million people are trapped in their residential buildings. Think of those 681 children that Russians killed since the outbreak of the war.
All these talks invariably are guided by documentation. 20-point peace plan was proposed at the outset. I think it was indicated by your government that a large number of those have been resolved, which leaves you at territorial surrender, territorial concessions. Are you ruling those out in the tenor of your speech today?
No, certainly not. I mean, we are committed to peace, and Ukrainians want peace more than anybody else. I mean, I think it's quite obvious that we want this war to be over. But certainly, we want that to be sustainable. We want to make sure that Russia will not reinvade us. And while we talk about future invasion, we have to stop this war. And it doesn't seem to be stopping. So not enough pressure has been put on Russia to actually force them into peace. Because, as you know, there are many different points. And we indeed have progressed significantly in the past several months. And a lot of the items have been agreed upon, and they seem to be acceptable. But there are still some sticking points which are most important in this whole dynamic. And certainly, while we are dying in Ukraine at the moment, Russians understand that they can put more pressure on Ukraine. They could put more pressure on President Zelensky by knocking out our energy system to freeze people, to weaponize winter. And Ukrainians actually, I mean, Putin will be surprised. He always gets Ukraine wrong. Putin always gets Ukraine wrong, right? He thinks that we're going to put pressure. But most of Ukrainians are now more mobilized than ever before. They understand where it's coming from. But we are not giving up. And more so, what's important here, we want to see justice. We have a delegation from Kyiv who's working on Russia's accountability. And we had some good engagements at DFED yesterday. And we're discussing the issues of a special tribunal on the crime of aggression. We're discussing the register of damages and the claims commission and the way people will get compensation for what Russians have done. And I think this is where we closely relate to any Australian, because justice is so important. That's the concept of this fair go that Australians are growing up with. And for us, that matters quite a lot.
All right, one final quick one from me for now, and then I'll hand over to the colleagues. Just on territorial negotiations, I don't so often hear references by your government to the resumption of 2014 or 2016 borders as non-negotiable. Has that position been conceded?
The current debate on the border is that, I don't want to quote Russia, but there's reality on the ground, as I like to say. Certainly, we understand that the 20% in general of the Ukrainian territory which is currently being occupied is already occupied. Regaining that territory under current conditions is quite difficult, right? However, the discussion is about Ukraine ceding the territory, right? Which is out of the question.
I understand.
So there is a legal side of it, and there is a de facto side. Yeah. During the Soviet Union, the West has not recognized the occupation of the Baltic nations. They were always under the occupation, and they maintained their exiled governments. So in a way, nobody in the right mind will ever recognize that territory as part of Russia, unless they are the clients of Moscow.
I understand the distinction. Thank you. All right, let's go to colleagues, and Stephen Jedgetts is here today from the ABC.
Thanks, Greg, and thanks, Ambassador, for your speech. I might, if that's okay, quote back a somewhat rhetorical question that you asked during the speech, specifically, are middle powers doing everything within their grasp or influence to ensure that not one drop of tainted petrochemicals sourced from Russian oil and gas laundered through third country refineries enters the supply chain? If it's okay, sir, I'd like you to answer that question in regards to Australia. I note late last year, Reliance Industries was quoted saying that it had given a guarantee that no Russian cargoes would be taken into its holds, which should be then passed on to Australia. Can Australia take that assurance on face value, or does it need to do more work trying to divine exactly what Russian oil may be making its way through third parties to Australia?
I'll certainly defer that question to Foreign Minister Penny Wong to comment on India and on the Reliance company there, but I can explain to you that 40% of the revenue which comes into Russia comes from the sale of oil and gas. And Russia is capable to wage this war because they're still capable of selling the oil and gas that they are producing by circumventing sanctions, by running a huge shadow defense fleet. And we have been cooperating with a coalition of countries on sanctions. And Australian government has been working very hard on this, and sanctions are imposed on the regular basis. And we really are grateful for the work that is being done. Certainly, we've tried engagement with the private operators on making sure that they can see that that oil or oil products that they're getting are not sourced in Russia. And this is where it comes to the issue of not of legal issues, but rather of moral issues. Because we are certainly concerned when a certain product is made and is using the child labor, right? It's been a big backlash against those companies who allegedly use child labor in China. So in this same respect, we should look and work making sure that the biggest importers of all products here can guarantee that the supply chain does not involve Russian oil. Because it's very easy for Russians to circumvent it. And certainly for the Indian private companies making billions out of it because they're going to get a good price from Russia, and then they just resell at a huge markup. So all the money just ends up there in the pockets of the owner of the Reliance, and we know who he is. And that's very important. And how can we ensure that it doesn't happen? I don't know. I don't have any question for that. But certainly, if secondary sanctions that the US Congress has proposed, and that could be enforced, that would be an enforcement, that would be serious. And certainly, how can we stop the shadow fleet? You know, those Russians changed the flags of the shadow fleet very easily. I'll give you an example. So the Cook Islands. So initially, there were lots of shadow fleet vessels under the Cook Islands. But now it kind of dwindled, and then there are many, many other African countries who have given their flag to Russians as well. So you can easily swap the flag. You can re-register the vessel. But the question is, can we actually enforce those sanctions, right? If they are not actually stopped, they are still circulating and they're still delivering oil to the refineries, we can just see where it's coming from. And they use intermediaries. I mean, and intermediaries like in Malaysia and Indonesia, and then from there it makes it to Singapore. So Singapore, for instance, is not importing any of the Russian oil, but they import oil from China, they import oil from Malaysia and Indonesia, where it's processed, right? So in a way, it's get blended and mixed up, and then we don't know what's the origin of the commodity is. So it's very complicated, and I understand the challenge because it's not so easy to address it, right? And certainly, I mean, we need to talk to legal experts. There are some at the ANU. There is also a Senate inquiry at the moment on the sanctions. Are they, effective or they are not effective? Is everything being done? So I hope when it's all completed in the Senate, there will be more answers for you. But thank you for this very good question, and I'm very thankful to the Australian government for standing strong with Ukraine.
Thank you.
Should the Royal Australian Navy be engaged in interceptions?
Oh, that's not a question for me. That's again for the minister.
Fair enough. All right, Grace Crivellaro is here from AAP.
Thank you so much for your address. Last we heard about Australia and Ukraine negotiating a security agreement was last July, I believe. Can you comment on where these negotiations are up to with the Security Pact, whether Prime Minister Anthony Albanese is still engaging on that, and whether the pact will be reached?
We're working very actively with DFAT on this, and we've have progressed, and certainly Ukraine would be very interested in signing it, but I think it would be probably more appropriate to ask this question to the Australian government. But as a Ukrainian government, we are very keen to do so. We have signed similar agreements with almost 30 countries, and we would be very keen to sign a similar agreement with Australia should the Australian government be interested. And there are lots of things actually which are part of it, and it's not only to, put the facts in place of $17 billion of assistance, for which we are very grateful in there, but it's also creating a framework for our engagement on defense, on security, on other matters. And I think this agreement, if it is approved and signed, of course, will open up doors to cooperation, which we haven't had before. And I believe that cooperation would be of huge benefit for Australia. And that includes, I'll just give you one example, is on the defense industry side. As you know, the innovation in electronic warfare, in unmanned systems as well, in Ukraine has been quite phenomenal during the past 4 years. And that innovation was, of course, driven by war. And we have been sourcing different components, including here in Australia, but also in other countries. But the way the warfare is changing, we have been able to get some of the best technology and create it, on the ground, and now it is cutting edge. The problem is that we're not the only ones, because Russians catch up very quickly, and then all the, clients of Russia and their friends got a hold of that technology, including North Korea, including Iran, including other potential adversaries in the future, and they all have that technology. They also help Russia to scale it up and produce it in large numbers. So in a way, for whatever it may happen, Ukraine stands ready to assist Australia with developing those unique sovereign capabilities that would be instrumental in deterring any potential conflict in the future, especially in modern warfare, which is more practical, but also in the way this new defense industry is applied in the battlefield. And I think it's important we stand ready to help and work and train and be kind of our payback to Australia for what they've done to help us.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Grace, thank you. I will indicate to Grace and other colleagues that if time permits, there may be further opportunities for you to come back and ask a second question. But with that said, we're very fortunate to have in the club today Peter Harcher from the Sydney Morning Herald and The Age.
Thanks, Greg. Some people might differ with you on that question. How fortunate or otherwise you are. Ambassador Peter Harcher from the Sydney Morning Herald and The Age, thank you for your address. You're calling for narrative support. If Anthony Albanese invited you to write a single line, a key sentence, to define the Australian version of the narrative you want to hear, what would you write?
I think you got me on a spot because...
Yes, it's called the National Press Club.
Yeah. No. Well, it's a very good question. I mean, let me just repeat the question so I got it right. If Prime Minister asked me to write a one-sentence narrative for
him to use.
For him to use.
Yes.
I would. I don't know, Greg. It's a good question. You see, I didn't expect it from you, Peter, but this is a good one. And this is, I mean, the narrative is that dictators cannot win. That would be my narrative. And dictators must fail for the benefit of global security, for the benefit of the global peace, if we can make it a bit longer. But I think, to elaborate on what I mean, because at the end of the day, helping Ukraine is not a charity. Australia has a vested interest in making sure that Russia fails in Ukraine. It's in the best interest for your regional security, for your stability here in the region. I shouldn't be reminding you that Russia is your neighbor. They have a Russian fleet in the Vladivostok. In the latest Asia Power Index, Russia has overtaken Australia as the #5 country, the most powerful country in Asia. As you can actually look at what Russians have been doing here in the ASEAN region in the past 3 years. They have really intensified their presence in the region. So helping Ukraine today is making sure that your region is stable, your region is secure, that maritime security is in place, and Russia is a disruptor. So we can't allow that to happen.
That might be too lengthy even for Anthony Albanese. So could we just use your first 3 words, dictators cannot win?
Absolutely.
Is that your defining statement? Thank you.
Thank you.
So just to follow up on Peter's question and indeed your answer, Mr. Ambassador, the Trump administration's conduct of foreign policy has not been favourable to principles, fundamental principles like respect for sovereignty. By that, I'm obviously referring to the abduction and trial of the Venezuelan president. I'm talking about the purchase or other form of control over Greenland. If dictators can't win, what about elected governments? Can they overstep, or elected leaders, can they overstep those lines? And why won't that embolden the Kremlin?
I think, Greg, the question is broader than that. I mean, democracies are in decline. And I think we should all step up for democracy. And democracies are dwindling. They're losing influence. They're not in fashion anymore. Authoritarian regimes seem to be more effective, actually, as a matter of fact. We can even look at the economic growth in many of the authoritarian countries. They can get things done quickly. But is it for the benefit of the people there? Do they have the freedoms? Do they enjoy the freedom of press? Do they enjoy freedom of speech? It all comes at that cost, right? And in a way, it's not for me to comment on, of course, there are different issues out there, but we, Ukrainians, Australians, and others should fight for democracy, because I think it's very precarious situation right now. It's a crazy world we live in, and the countries that we are used to knowing as the beacons of democracy, may not be so. And who is a beacon of democracy? And I think Australia could be a beacon of democracy.
Is the US a beacon of democracy?
Australia is a beacon of democracy, I've been here, 4 years, and I love watching your elections, I think this is like the most fascinating expression of democracy out there, It's true debates. You don't like your government, you get another government in. You don't like this one, you vote them out. Every 3 years, it does happen. It's amazing. Russia has not seen any change in 26 years. And let me tell you, they won't see anything until Putin dies. And what about those Russian people who don't have, who die in large numbers? 1.2 million casualties. They now lost more people than in any other war except for Second World War. By the way, this is where Ukraine lost more people than Russia, actually, in that war. But that's a different topic.
Okay. Corey McLeod is a director at the club and also from Innovation Oz.
Thank you for your address, Ambassador. I wanted to reference back to one of your previous responses talking about, I guess, the technology race that you're seeing and how Russia and some of its kind of, partners, if you like, are, sharing that intelligence. Ukraine has an incredible amount of battlefield data, which is vital to be training, AI engines and in part of this sort of defence response. Is there a way that Australia and other middle powers, can be working with Ukraine and leveraging that data? And how do you assign value to it? Because it's an incredible resource in, practical application.
No, it's a very good question, Corey. Indeed, the million hours of the battlefield information is invaluable for the governments and for the defense industry. And I have talked to a number of military tech companies here, both primes and smaller ones, and they are actually very eager to get a hold of it, because with today's AI, we can actually analyze that data because it's huge, And now, thankfully, we have this quantum computing, and we can actually go and analyze it and apply it to some of the innovation and products that those companies are working on. And certainly, Ukrainian government stands ready to cooperate with the Australian government, be it on on that practical aspect of lessons learned or application of the knowledge for the defense industry, but also jointly developing some of the, let's say, maritime unmanned systems, for instance. Our Magura and Baby Sea water drones, maritime drones, have demonstrated super efficiency of going into the Russian seaport and shooting down Russian fighter jet. And that's all done by an unmanned system out there. Looks like a science fiction almost, but it does happen. And we have that technology, and jointly we can set up production here in Australia to cater to your needs and to the needs of the like-minded countries in the region. So I think there is an opportunity there. But it also goes beyond that. This is where, this is my proposition of my Q&A here. I mean, supporting Ukraine brings lots of benefits, and that was one clear example of that. But there is another example which also involves America. We've always wanted to talk about America. Both Ukraine and Australia has bilateral minerals deals with America. EU needs, and everybody, all the developed countries of the West, of the democracies, they need to ensure sustainable global supply chains for rare earth minerals. We now have a bottleneck. We have a monopoly in China, which has controlled all the processing, right? We need to diversify processing of rare earth minerals. Hopefully, when this war is over, and we're going to get a hold of our nuclear energy, we are sourcing your uranium, by the way, here, and we can set up processing of rare earth using the offtake from Australia, processing it in Ukraine, and cater to the US and European needs. And this is another example where we can cooperate. It goes a little bit beyond your question, Corey, sorry, but I just thought I would use it as an opportunity to share another opportunity where we can work together.
It was actually my second question if I was going to get one, so thank you for answering it.
Very efficient. All right, next question's from Emma MacDonald from Women in Media.
Emma MacDonald, Women in Media. Thank you so much, Your Excellency, for your frank and fearless address today. Australians are watching various world leaders undertake their various world leadership roles to varying degrees of success or failure or embarrassment, depending on who you're watching at any given time. Your leader, President Zelensky, has amassed enormous goodwill and popularity both here and around the world. What are the leadership qualities that stand him apart from other leaders? And you called Putin a thug. What's the adjective that you would use to describe Trump? Sorry.
I'll talk about Zelensky because he's my president. So, and we can certainly get anybody else to talk about American president. Maybe we have some Americans in the room. But I will talk about my president because, this is what, again, Putin underestimated him. They had a meeting in Paris, I think it was 2019, and Putin was convinced that this is just a comedian. He was very arrogant towards Zelensky, and as you know, had a very successful career as a producer of movies and films and entertainment shows. But he was also an executive. He ran a business. So he was, he ran a business, he was part of a business, and he understands the power of communications. And I think, what we can talk about Zelensky is then there was that ride that was offered to him, right? And instead of picking up the ride, he clearly said to the whole world, by picking up his phone and saying, I'm here, my team is here, and we're here to fight. We need ammunition. I don't need a ride. And I think that he's bold, right? He can confront the challenge, and that's what inspired not only Ukrainians to fight, but the entire world to go and support Ukraine. Because we all remember the analysis out there at the beginning of the war. We were not getting the support we wanted because the analysis was that Ukraine is going to fall. There is no point in supplying any weapons to Ukraine because it's going to fall. And only, those several countries, who supplied us with NLAWs, Britain, with Stingers from some of the Baltic nations, Javelins, which were able to buy from Americans actually previously under Trump, they were instrumental in stopping those tanks rolling in. But generally, the analysis was, including, probably here, but it was not, everybody was thinking like that. Ukraine is going to fall. And I think that was the leadership of President Zelensky, where he could really stand up and say, look, no, we're going to fight. And I think he's a fighter. And I don't think there could have been any better president to be at this time for Ukraine, of course, the most difficult times. And we have our own challenges. It's not easy for him. It's not easy for anybody in Ukraine. And certainly, but definitely, that this is where that leadership comes from. I think the leadership comes from because he's a self-made man. You know, he comes from a very, you know, kind of traditional Soviet background, coming up in Kryvyi Rih, which is a very industrial city. His father was an academic, and he just had to make himself. And I think that, you know, that trait, the self-made man who made it basically from a very, you know, poor part of Ukraine. I mean, not so poor, but industrial. And I mean, those were difficult times in the 90s that had to survive there. I mean, made him the man who he is.
Well, we wish him well. Thank you.
Emma, thank you. Next up is Nick Stewart from Ability News.
Thank you very much for your speech. You talked about narrative. If I can ask a two-part about this. Firstly, the narrative that you tell is very simple. Russia can't win. Russia has invaded Ukraine. They're simple concepts. We understand them. They travel. Why is it that somehow these these simple messages haven't resonated as widely as they could have? Has it been a problem with the former analysts of the Soviet Union that they just didn't get with the times when the Soviet Union changed and became Russia and Ukraine? Have we been listening to the wrong narratives? Are they sometimes coming to the fore?
Look, true, we've had a discussion before this, and often in the old times when you would look at Russia, the Soviet Union, or you would look into the history of Russia, it was always through the prism of Moscow, right? And Ukraine should be studied from in the course of anti-colonialism, because we were colonized by Russia. Russia invaded Ukraine for 300 years, and they raped us and killed us for a very long period of time. But the problem is that kind of in many circles, you know, the tradition of studying Russia, you know, even in the West, nobody said Soviet Union, everybody said Russia, right? Whereas we talked about 15 different republics, and Ukraine being, you know, as a founding member of the UN, along with, you know, Socialist Republic of Belarus as well. But, you know, that's a different topic. But the idea is that, of course, you know, in the academic circles, especially those of Soviet studies, let's say, and who look at Russia, there was kind of a little bit of a kind of legacy of that. And also, I mean, there was very little knowledge about Ukraine, let's face it. And it just applied not only to academic circles, but generally. Remember when Russians invaded Ukraine in 2014, the coverage was different and people didn't fully understand what was happening. And in Australia, for instance, it was only after MH17 that it grabbed the attention of what's going on there. And I remember initially for many journalists who were covering the war, especially in 2014, so they come and they say, well, look, what's the position of Ukraine? You give a comment, and then what's the position of Russia? And they think, well, truth me, it should be somewhere in between, right? And this is where you get it wrong, because when you mix it up, when you take something totally false, right, and then you take something true, and then you mix it up, you still make it false. And that's a trap, and we shouldn't get in there. So, of course, a lot of that comes from the education about the history of Ukraine and how it came about and what we are fighting for. Because this is not only our fight, this is our fight against colonialism, modern-day colonialism, and where Russia is an imperialistic country on a conquest to change borders by force. And they are the only ones, I mean, at the moment, who are using kinetic power and weapons to achieve that. And I think this is a huge and serious threat. But speaking more of Russia's, you know, malign foreign influence, Russians are, you know, engaging in hybrid war, in disinformation, in gray zone operations, you know, cutting the cables underwater, undermining democratic governments, running campaigns within those governments. And democracies are a target for Russia. The reason democracies are a target, because it's easy to disrupt a democracy. And hence, we should be working together to build that resilience. And certainly, a case of Ukraine is a case where we can assist Australia, we can assist your neighbors here in the Pacific, who are small nations. And they need that protection. They need those principles and norms of the UN Charter, which Russia so blatantly violated. Because if it's not there, they're a target. or could be a target. And we can help them, identify those threats coming from different sources, because we've been a target for Russia for 35 years. This, Russian malign foreign influence did not start in Ukraine 15 years ago. It started back when we just became independent. And Putin had a plan for a long time to destroy that and destroy our sovereignty.
Thank you. That's the other question you asked or posed in your speech, but you didn't decide. You said the possibility of nuclear weapons. Perhaps things would have been different for Ukraine if you'd actually possessed a nuclear weapon. Do you think that this is true? And isn't the problem the narrative that was going on in Putin's head? And how could a nuclear weapon change something like that? It might threaten Russia, but it wouldn't change his narrative that we've seen him writing about in the past, the idea of Mother Russia. How can you destroy an incorrect idea like that using a bomb?
Look, we all know that the idea of having weapons of mass destruction is that we never use them, right? Because it's the end of the world. But they serve as a deterrent. So certainly, in the retrospect, of course, if we had nuclear weapons, it would be a deterrent against any invasion, right? But certainly, we're not interested in renewing that. The question was to the Middle powers or other countries. I mean, what can they rely on to protect themselves? And are they now looking into developing the nuclear weapons? That's very dangerous. So instead of investing money in dealing with issues such as climate change, many governments are actually now arming themselves. There is an arms race already globally, do we want it or not. And also they're thinking about starting nuclear programs. And that's a threat to the world. And I think there is one reason for that, was that Russia invaded Ukraine. So we all have a stake in making sure that Russia fails, making sure that Russia is held accountable, and making sure that we build the deterrence. Because the best deterrence that we Australians and others can build is to make sure that Russia fails. Because if they don't, and they get the piece of land, and they may actually attempt to get more land later, that looks like a blueprint. And we want to avoid that.
Thank you, Nick. I think we can squeeze one final question by inviting Stephen Jedgetts back.
Thanks, Ambassador. I might, if that's okay, once again read back to you briefly from your speech. You made a reference that was intriguing at the beginning to institutions that wanted to wish away the war. And you said, I think, that there was, in some quarters, some strong resistance to you using the approaching 4-year mark of Russia's invasion to give this speech. I'm not asking, well, I am asking you to name names, I guess, more honestly. Are you able to say exactly where this pushback came from what sectors of Australian society, if this is a reference to Australia, and from which institutions and why?
Look, this is a very tricky question, but that was in different parts of the speech, and they're not closely related, and actually not only applies to Australia, but generally. And a lot of that comes down from the fatigue. And you as a journalist, you know it better than I do, that there are certain topics that you write about because they are topical and they are there. But if that issue is still there, it becomes boring. Nobody clicks on those stories. And in my experience, and this is unfortunately, a situation for Ukraine, because people stopped reading stories about atrocities. Because when you read a story about war in Ukraine, it makes you sad. So I'm asking you, how many sad stories can you read per day? And in a way, the response is, well, look, people just don't read that many sad stories. They don't want to read sad stories. They want to read something inspiring. And of course, it's very difficult to talk about war and still to remain inspiring. And certainly, in terms of raising the issue, certainly every country has its own, priorities and agendas. I mean, for Ukraine, there is just only one priority, is making sure that we can defend ourselves. And certainly, I'm just describing a general atmosphere, which came from different sides. I mean, there is not specifically an institution in this particular case. This is more, I've talked to journalists, I've talked to analysts. I see the appetite of covering Ukraine. It's kind of, in a way, disappeared in the last 3-4 weeks, if you just see what Australian media has been writing. I mean, I understand you can't be writing about Ukraine all the time, right? But at the same time, I mean, I understand that the kind of like, look, there are other issues and they must be addressed. I totally get it. But certainly a fatigue is growing because definitely each government has its own priorities, and I totally get it. But I just believe that our ultimate goals are aligned, and we've discussed it here in this setting, of what we want to achieve and why it is in the interest of the free world, making sure that we can end this war on Ukraine's terms.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Well, despite that fatigue, I'm certain, Mr. Ambassador, that there will be some forced reflection once again in this country and certainly in your own when the anniversary comes around on the 24th of February. So with that said, we wish you the best on that occasion and beyond. And thank you once again for joining us here at the National Press Club. Thank you.